Donald Trump seems to be putting a lot of pressure from the outside of the immediacy of Ukraine. Ukraine at the center, the Ukraine-Russia war at the center. Donald Trump seems to be putting pressure from the outside and squeezing Vladimir Putin more and more on the global stage, which might force Putin to come to the negotiating table, because President Zelensky has been very forward-leaning in what he's been proposing for peace talks to try and stop the war. Vladimir Putin's the one who hasn't given one single concession at all. In fact, it seems to be he's added further requirements in. But as he gets squeezed more and more from the outside, and as Ukraine is starting to have more tactical success, then I think Putin will start to feel the real pressure, and we might see him going for negotiations at some stage later this year.
Philip Ingram is a retired British Army colonel and former senior intelligence officer. Welcome to our program, Colonel Ingram.
Nice to be back on again.
Let's begin our session with Iran and Ukraine. The United States has asked Ukraine for help defending Gulf nations against Iranian drones, according to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Ukraine has agreed to this, and President Zelensky right now is sending military experts and probably Ukrainian soldiers or officers to the Gulf nation to provide this help with countering Iranian Shahid drones. How did we get here, and what is your reaction to this?
My reaction is I've got a big smile on my face. I remember Donald Trump saying to President Zelensky in that Oval Office interview or ambush, you don't hold any cards. Well, now Donald Trump is asking President Zelensky for some of his cards. Ukraine is probably the most experienced military in the world when it comes to countering the drone threat and the Shahed drone threat, because you're being attacked by it almost on a nightly basis. And what's quite certain is the Middle East countries were not prepared for the volumes of these low-cost suicide kamikaze drones that have been fired at them by the Iranians. And using a $1 million Patriot missile or other air defense missiles, where the stocks of them globally are relatively low compared to the volume of potential drone threat that's out there, means that a much more cost-effective way of dealing with these Shahed drones has to be found quickly, and Ukraine is the best source for that capability in the world, I would argue, at the moment.
Let's cover also Iran campaign. From your perspective, has the United States prepared enough for this war? Because, as you just mentioned, they were firing Patriot missiles to intercept cheap Shahed drones.
Yes, I'm not sure whether the Americans miscalculated the Iranian reaction. Certainly, they were aware that there would be a ballistic missile threat, and they're well prepared for that ballistic missile threat. And I think if you look at the overall activity that there's been and what's happened since America started this conflict 7 days ago, as we're recording this, they're probably, what Donald Trump is saying, ahead of schedule. Because they've reinforced the suppression of enemy air defense, destroying Iran's air defense capability, both its missile defense and its aircraft on the ground. They have taken out at least one layer of the Iranian leadership, as we've seen, and again, at least one layer of leadership in the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps and other security forces. But Iran is still able to function as a state because like every state, it's got other layers. It's got people ready to step up and step in. So, America with Israel is now moving on to the next level and trying to ensure that all of those that can direct military activity or direct political actions that are against the aims and goals of this conflict are removed, and thereby, once they've gone, and once the security apparatus has been destroyed, then that's a time when we might see the Iranian people standing up, or we might see whoever steps in as a leadership suddenly going, this is suicide if we continue. Let's get back to the negotiating table and sit down with the Americans properly. So we're a week into something that I think has got at least several more weeks, if not a lot longer, to play out.
From your perspective, have Iranians overplayed their hands by attacking Gulf nations, and did US expect such a retaliation?
Well, I'll answer the second bit first. I think the US probably recognized that Iran could lash out like this. And what surprised me is the accuracy of a lot of the Iranian targeting initially. They've targeted primarily US military facilities, but also then some civilian targets and some targets from the Gulf states. Has this been good for Iran? No. The Gulf states were on two sides of the argument as to whether they were supporting Iran or not supporting Iran, or pro-United States or anti-United States across the region. The region was divided. What Iran's attacks on just about every country across the region has done is it's united all of the countries in an anti-Iranian stance, primarily for their own force protection. But this is the first time, I think, in decades that we've seen the Middle Eastern countries so united. How long it's going to last, I don't know.
Let's also cover a position of Russia and Putin's view of this. How does this affect Russia globally? Because Russia has lost another friendly dictator to Vladimir Putin.
Well, I think Vladimir Putin will be feeling, he will have two emotions with regard to this. Yes, he's lost another dictator, he's lost another country, a huge country that he was relying on for his drone technology, relying on for some of his missile technology. There's certainly been a lot of swapping of technology ideas, because some of the drones that have been fired across the Middle East, it's quite clear they've got Russian technology in them. So Iran has taken Russian ideas and Russian technology and improved their own drones. And this comes on the back of Vladimir Putin losing Bashar al-Assad and his access to the Mediterranean through his Mediterranean fleet port in Syria. He's lost his influence across the whole of the region now. And that will be hurting him, because he used the Middle East as a stepping stone for his operations down into Africa and elsewhere. And it's also somewhere where he had built up an awful lot of relations when it came to moving money and finances around the world. So he will be hurting from that perspective. However, he will be smiling from the aspect that the United States is now focused on the Middle East, not focused on supporting Ukraine in its war with Russia. And a lot of other countries are now focused on the Middle East. And the political capital that it's taking from other countries around the world means that political effort is not being put into trying to put additional pressure on Russia to stop its illegal war in Ukraine. So Putin will be smiling at that. He'll be happy with that. He'll be happy to see the Patriot missiles, cruise missiles, and other smart weapons being expended in the Middle East, because he knows that they cannot then be provided to Ukraine at some stage in the future. But he will be concerned about this loss of influence that he's getting across the Middle East. And it's interesting. Russia's being squeezed from the outside. However, there is another short-term benefit for Moscow, in that the global oil prices are going up and will spike even higher. And this is where Putin will try and fill the void of oil and gas not coming out through the Straits of Hormuz with Russian oil and gas, whether that be illegally smuggled into different countries. And countries will take that, and he's likely to make an awful lot of money out of this. That'll help him fund this his continuing illegal war in Ukraine.
Also, recently I read some interesting articles indicating that Putin is trapped by this situation around the globe, because on the one hand he can't criticize Trump because he would like to maintain this so-called special relations with President Trump. On the other hand, he has to say something about this, because Russians are embarrassed by these developments in the Middle East?
Oh, Putin is in a very, very difficult position. And domestically, it's making him look weak. And it's interesting whenever you examine, you step back, and we're very quick to criticize Donald Trump for his lack of immediate support and the language that he's using against Ukraine and everything else. And I'm one of the biggest critics of that. But actually, when you look at what Donald Trump is doing from a wider perspective, we've got him helping destroy Russia's support in the Middle East. Russia was relying on an awful lot of support from Ukraine. That will help Ukraine eventually. We're seeing the Americans taking a greater lead in dealing with the shadow fleet vessels that are moving oil products around the world, and smuggling Russian oil products against sanctions around the world, with them arresting a ship in the middle of the Atlantic, and putting pressure on European nations to start doing the same. And we're seeing that. So Donald Trump seems to be putting a lot of pressure from the outside of the immediacy of Ukraine. Ukraine at the center, the Ukraine-Russia war at the center. Donald Trump seems to be putting pressure from the outside and squeezing Vladimir Putin more and more on the global stage, which might force Putin to come to the negotiating table, because President Zelensky has been very forward-leaning in what he's been proposing for peace talks to try and stop the war. Vladimir Putin's the one who hasn't given one single concession at all. In fact, it seems to be he's added further requirements in. But as he gets squeezed more and more from the outside, and as Ukraine is starting to have more tactical success, then I think Putin will start to feel the real pressure, and we might see him going for negotiations at some stage later this year.
You just mentioned about Ukrainian tactical successes. Probably you mentioned about ground successes, because Ukraine has liberated some territory, and also this was influenced by this Starlink situation, when Russian soldiers weren't able to use Starlink due to decision of Elon Musk. How can you assess this tactical success and most recent Ukrainian strikes deep inside Russia, also affecting the Admiral Asen, Putin's frigate, damaged by most recent, probably Ukraine maritime drone?
Well, the Admiral Asen is another fantastic example of the operational level of warfare that Ukraine has been so good at taking to Russia. Degrading Russia's oil and gas pumping, storage, and processing capabilities, attacking Russian generals in Moscow so that they don't feel safe, attacking Russian strategic airfields. Ukraine, without a navy, has effectively decimated the Black Sea Fleet. And that is something that naval historians around the world and tacticians are watching very closely indeed, because it will change global naval tactics. And of course, we have mysterious LNG tankers blowing up in the Mediterranean and elsewhere that would suggest that Ukrainian special forces and intelligence units have had something to do with that, because it's again impacting Russia's shadow fleet. And therefore, I've assessed for quite some time that at that operational level, Ukraine is dictating the pace of what is going on, and therefore it has the initiative. Whereas at the tactical level, Russia, there's almost a stalemate, but Russia was advancing tens of meters a day, but they were still advancing very slowly at huge cost from personnel. But now Ukraine seems to have wrestled that very small tactical initiative back again, and seem to be controlling the what is going on, certainly on parts of the front line, and that can only be good. And Vladimir Putin, or Vladimir Putin's generals, will, I think, be concerned about this, because we're then coming up into spring, and Russia was probably planning some form of spring offensive. Whether they will have the ability to do that or not, I've always been skeptical. Ukraine might be planning further spring offensives. But what I'm beginning to see with Ukraine as well, which I find something that is very positive, is these attacks that are going in tend to be what I describe as all arms attacks. So it's utilizing drones from the air with artillery and armored vehicles on the ground with then infantry advances. Bringing that together is a level of sophistication that Ukraine has been trained in for many, many years, but hasn't been part of the way the forces have been structured and everything else. And this suggests to me that we're seeing more of these sorts of tactics, better training coming in so that Ukraine can use the very valuable manpower and the very valuable limited number of weapons that it's got from the West to even better effect. I would hope that this isn't just small chunks of territory that Ukraine manages to take back. I hope we see a bigger push and even more territory taken back. That will concern the Russians enormously if that happens.
That's a really interesting development you just mentioned, because Ukrainian defense forces liberated more territory than they lost during this last 2 weeks of February 2026, and this is for the first time since summer counteroffensive in 2023, according to U.S. Institute for the Study of War. How could this influence negotiating table?
Well, I think at the moment, because it's relatively small amounts of territory, and for a longer period of time, Russia had the advantage. The Russian generals will still be briefing Vladimir Putin that this is just a minor setback. This is just, us reorganizing our defenses. We'll stop the Ukrainians and we'll start to take territory back again. So, in the immediate terms, I don't think it's going to do anything. But if Ukraine manages to reinforce its successes and start to push the Russians back even further and have some successes where they're taking not just tens of square kilometers of territory back, but hundreds of square kilometers of territory back, then this is something that I think Vladimir Putin will start to get concerned about, especially if there are more successes at this operational level, stopping Russia being able to fund and support its frontline operations. Again, combine that with what's happening at the strategic level, where Russia is losing its support base in the Middle East, and Donald Trump is putting more pressure on the Shadow Fleet tankers and everything else. All of this is forcing Putin into a position where he knows he can't maneuver. If we then get the Russian people starting to question more and more of what's going on, that's when Putin will get really worried. And that's when I think Putin will come to the negotiating table. And if he comes to the negotiating table, what he'll try and do is just go for some form of ceasefire. He will want to just pause things so that he can lick his wounds. He can try and rebuild his capability. He won't want to stop the war. He won't want to come up with any settlement that doesn't achieve his objectives.
Also, according to Bloomberg, Russia is considering full withdrawal from negotiations if Ukraine does not cede Donbas to Russia. However, previous Bloomberg reporting indicated that there were some interesting meetings in the Kremlin even before the Alaska summit, and Kremlin officials were discussing possible endgame for this with Vladimir Putin. He just asked his inner circle whether they would like to end this war, and they supported this initiative and told him, yes, we are ready to this. If Ukraine surrenders Donbas to Russia, yeah, we can end this war. But don't you think that this could indicate that Russians began to consider any kind of endgame scenario?
Well, it's interesting that Russia considering its endgames, but it's always asked for the Donbass, and Vladimir Putin and his generals know that it will be virtually impossible for them to take it militarily, and therefore they want to try and get it diplomatically. If we look at the war as a whole, we're now into its 5th year. Vladimir Putin has lost his strategic objective. His strategic objective was twofold: one, to stop NATO's expansion. Well, NATO's got 2 additional countries, and 2, to collapse the Ukrainian government and put a pro-Russian puppet government in place that would bring Ukraine aligned with Russia in the same way that Belarus is. He's failed to do that. And from a military perspective, all of the territory that was captured in the early days of the war, the majority of that Ukraine has recaptured again. And therefore, Vladimir Putin has had to go for a secondary objective. And his secondary objective is the Donbass. And he's already had the Russian constitution absorb the geographic boundaries of the Donbass into Russia, and as part of that, he is in a position now where if he doesn't get the whole of the Donbass as some form of settlement at the end, he loses face enormously, and whether he could recover from that or not, I don't know, and that's why they're saying the end game is. If Ukraine surrenders the territory that it still holds in the Donbass, then we'll stop the war. Does that mean that Russia would stop the war? No, they'd pause it. This would be seen as a salami slice of Ukraine. Vladimir Putin would then set the conditions, or Vladimir Putin's successor would set the conditions to come and try and take another salami slice at some stage later, maybe 5 years ahead, maybe 2 years ahead, maybe 10 years ahead. But Russia's expansionism will continue. This is why it's important that Russia is properly defeated and forced to withdraw from the internationally recognized territory of and boundaries of Ukraine.
From your perspective, can Vladimir Putin survive possible endgame, even ceasefire on favorable for Russia terms, because they have sacrificed too much? Russia has lost probably 1.3 million soldiers, and this war has entered its 5th year. Can he survive possible endgame?
Well, I think he probably can if he gets something that he can declare as a victory, and he's set the conditions both within his immediate inner circle, but also to the Russian people. That victory is the Donbass, and he would then, if he got that, turn around and say, yes, he's beaten NATO, he's beaten Ukraine, he's looked after the Russian people because he illegally claims that the people of the Donbass are Russian people. And he will spin that as a victory in the same way that he's been spinning the reasoning behind this war and lying to the Russian people. The Russian people, by the time they find out those lies are there, well, there isn't any real opposition, so there's nothing much that they can do about it, given the security crackdowns that we're seeing across Russia. And Putin is an old man now. He's not going to last for decades longer. However, he will be grooming people to take over from him who will be of the same or similar mindsets, and therefore, the threat of Russia will continue for many, many decades to come, I believe.
Let's also cover our final topic and probably final questions about global stage. Has the Third World War already begun, from your perspective?
Oh, that is a very interesting question. I think it might well have done. Certainly, there's the danger there that we are on a clearer path to a global conflict. The war between Russia and Ukraine was a start, but that was sort of kept almost to Europe. The Middle East, the war is geographically kept to the Middle East at the moment. But again, as we saw with Ukraine, with what Russia did in the Black Sea, with the destroying the Ukrainian agriculture and ability to export grain and cooking oil, that had a global impact. The potential closure of the Straits of Hormuz, where 20% of the world's liquid natural gas and 20 to 25% of the world's oil goes through, will have a global impact and impact global economies. And of course, with all the weapons being expended, Xi Jinping will be turning around and going, well, if America has run out of all of its cruise missiles and its smart bombs and its Patriot missiles to protect itself and everything else, it may be too weak to support Taiwan if I decide to take it now. So he will almost certainly be sitting there trying to work out whether him going to take Taiwan through force is something that he could do. Certainly from a political perspective, he can argue and use the same arguments that Donald Trump has used in going into Iran. So there couldn't be a more optimal time for Xi Jinping to consider taking Taiwan by force. If that happens, everything is linked. And if that happens, we then get into a global conflict scenario, albeit in 3 separate areas, but the links will come together much faster than the links will be broken. And that's what really worries me.
Thank you, Colonel Ingram, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Slava Ukraini. Thank you.